I'll just have to silence ourselves on YouTube because there'll be an echo. So hang on 1 second and then I'll introduce you and hand over. I'll just have to silence. There we go. Okay, good. We're ready. So welcome everyone. God, it feels like ages since we were here. It has been ages, months and months. We didn't really do much online in July and August because we were preparing for a busy fall and winter, and people have busy summers, particularly in upstate New York. They're often out at lakes and camps and things. You can hear I'm a little bit sick tonight, so I won't be doing much of the talking because I'm sure I'll get a coughing fit. But I wanted to just welcome you all. As I say, it's been a long time since we've been back, and I'm delighted to have with us tonight Professor Hidetaka Hirota, who got his PhD from Boston College. He is associate professor at the moment at Berkeley College, and he's teaching a social and legal history of the United States with a particular focus on immigration. He has served as a Mellon Research Fellow in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities at Columbia University, taught at CUNY down in the city, and also Sophia University in Japan. The book that we'll be hearing from tonight, Expelling the Poor, received the first book award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, the Lewis P. Rudnick Award from the New England American Studies Association, and the Donald Murphy Prize from the American Conference for Irish Studies. So, as well as several honorable mentions. So it's really going to be it's a fascinating talk for us. The book really deals with how America dealt with the influx of impoverished immigrants during particularly the Great Hunger in the middle of the 19th century there, when we've seen in other talks how nativists, particularly in New York and Massachusetts, used colonial poor laws to develop policies from preventing destitute foreigners and others deporting those leaving Europe, and how to deport them back out of the country. So this is really the first sustained study of immigration control that early in the process, because of course federal restriction like immigration doesn't happen until a little bit later. So Hidetaka's point is that it was actually prejudice about the Irish, and particularly economic concerns about their poverty, rather than anti-Asian racism, which comes later and which crystallizes in the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1890s. And so he's challenging these long-standing ideas that immigration was unregulated prior to those passages. So I'm delighted to turn it over to you, Hidetaka, Dr. Hirota, and I'm going to take myself off and mute myself and highlight you. And welcome, everyone. Thanks again. And so anyone who has questions can use this Q&A down here, you know that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Perfect. Thank you. Thank everyone for joining me and having me this evening, I guess, in New York time. It's a great pleasure to be here virtually. And I'd like to thank Dr. Elizabeth Stack for inviting me to this event, and the Irish American Heritage Museum for having me arranging making the arrangements to help me today. Let me start the slides for today. Oops. Wrong place to start. Is it appearing well?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you once again for the kind introduction. I'm a historian of U.S. immigration, and I specialize in the history of American nativism and xenophobia, and also American immigration law and policy, especially the 19th century, during 19th century. And today I'd like to introduce my first book, which was actually just introduced by Dr. Stack, but I want to sort of follow up the kind of introduction. So this book explores two historical topics. And first is the nature and impact of anti-Irish nativism in the 19th century, in 19th century America. And the second topic that I'm addressing in this book is the origins of immigration restriction in the US, especially deportation policy. And let me first briefly outline the whole project. During the first half of the 19th century, as you know, as the members of this museum know, probably much better than I do, the states of Massachusetts and New York received growing immigrants of impoverished Catholic Irish due to famine in Ireland. And of course, their religion, Catholicism, Catholic faith, triggered an outburst of anti-Irish nativism, the hostility toward foreigners in those states, New York and Massachusetts, and other states as well. But so did their poverty. And without the physical strength and financial resources to support themselves, a significant portion of these Irish immigrants entered public almshouses as paupers in those cities. And in 1840s, in order to reduce Irish poverty and pauperism, nativists, opponents of Irish immigration in Massachusetts and New York, developed policies for prohibiting, first, the landing of destitute foreigners, and in Massachusetts in particular, an exceptionally strong anti-Irish, anti-Catholic tradition inspired the state legislature to go one step further than simple entry restriction by developing laws for deporting foreign paupers already resident in the state back to Europe, Canada, or other US states. So as a whole, my book kind of demonstrates how these policies in 19th century Massachusetts and New York laid foundations for US, the national level immigration control in later periods. And the project makes very important, I think, important contributions to scholarship on 19th century America and also American immigration, in important ways. And most importantly, my book kind of fundamentally revises the way we think of the history of American immigration policy, and especially the origins of American immigration control. And this question is related to my first topic, that is the nature of anti-Irish nativism sentiment in America. So the anti-Irish nativism itself is a really popular topic among scholars, right? It has been extensively and intensively studied. But my issue is that, previous historians tend to see mid-19th century nativism against the Irish simply as a form of bigotry, assuming that this bigotry was intense, but ultimately did not affect America's border policy. So, for example, this is one of the many cartoons against the Irish made in the 19th century. And here, the Irish American on the left is described as a drunkard, and then with the German immigrant, who is another subject of nativism at the time, they were seen as carrying stealing belt box. So it's a kind of political critique, as well as cultural critique of Irish and German immigrants. And this is probably the most infamous, but also sort of widely seen cartoon of an Irish immigrant. You see the face is kind of described as simian, and on the right hand, the immigrant is holding a rum bottle, and those cartoons really illuminate the intense cultural sentiment against the Irish. But my question here is that historians didn't really ask whether or not such a sentiment was actually translated into actual immigration policy. Did such an so we know that the sentiment was anti-Irish sentiment was very intense. But again, the question is, did it have any impact on America's border policy? And historians have neglected this question for a long time, and as a result, historians have, for the most part, held that immigration to the US was free from regulation until the federal government started restricting Chinese immigration in the late 19th century with the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this is how historians have understood the history of American immigration policy. So there is an allegedly era of open borders until the 1882, when the federal government started regulating immigration with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then later in New York, Ellis Island Immigration Landing Station was opened. And then in the early 20th century, another kind of iconic landing station, Angel Island, was opened in California. So the traditional narrative is that there was Irish famine immigration, and then there was an anti-Irish nativism. But once again, this hostility did not fundamentally affect America's border policy, and that's the kind of traditional interpretation of history that my work tries to sort of correct. I do not go into the detail of the this chart, but this short list shows the series of state-level immigration laws passed in Massachusetts and New York since the 18th century. And as a whole, the list gives you a kind of sense of how actively immigration control operated in these states, even before the introduction of federal, like national laws to regulate Chinese immigration. So as early as the late 18th century, New York and Massachusetts passed a passenger and deportation law. But you notice that over the course of 1840s and 50s, the so-called the famine decade, you see that immigration power in these states continuously expanded, and that was largely in response to Irish immigration, and also in response to nativists' kind of call for immigration restriction against the against Irish immigrants. So so to further underscore the significance of these laws, yeah, I will demonstrate later, how I can explain how these policies later in New York and Massachusetts later developed into a national immigration policy. Now, related to this point, so historians, as I said, conventionally locate the origins of American immigration control in anti-Asian racism on the West Coast. And in the late 19th century, in 1880s, the federal government developed laws to restrict Chinese immigration, right? But without downplaying the significance of this anti-Asian racism, my book demonstrates how some of the roots of federal immigration laws lay in cultural prejudice against Irish, but more fundamentally in economic concerns about the poverty of the Irish on the East Coast, especially Massachusetts and New York. Right, so that's the kind of big picture of the project. Now, let me just give you a little clearer sense of how state-level immigration control kind of operated. And I will introduce some portions of my book that explore Massachusetts deportation policy during the 1850s, when anti-Irish sentiment, nativism kind of reached its highest point with the outbreak of the so-called Know Nothing movement in the United States before the Civil War. The Know Nothing movement was the most aggressive anti-immigrant and also anti-Catholic, which is to say anti-Irish political movement in the US before the Civil War. So here's what happened. Here's a kind of brief overview of the Know Nothing movement. The Know Nothings, as a nativist politician, they advocated the weakening political power of immigrants, especially the Irish. And by the emergence in 1854 of nativist politicians, Know Nothings, Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, had developed an extensive system of immigration control, including landing regulation and, as I said, post-entry deportations. But the Know Nothings in Massachusetts really implemented the state immigration laws on an unprecedented scale. So we can sort of, by analyzing the deportation by the Know Nothings in Massachusetts, we can really see the importance, centrality of anti-Irish nativism, strengths of anti-Irish nativism in Massachusetts before the Civil War, but at the same time, its importance for the longer history of American immigration policy. Okay, so in the elections of 1854, the nativist Know Nothing Party, Massachusetts, official title was American Party, but it was so-called Know Nothings. This party, Massachusetts, really sweepingly captured the governorship and nearly all legislative seats in the state legislature, and also as well as the mayor's office in Boston. So in other words, Massachusetts was completely kind of controlled by the nativist politicians, know-nothings. And in his inaugural address, the know-nothing governor of Massachusetts, Henry Gardner, specified the deportation of foreign paupers as the central agenda of his government, and he called Irish Americans, Irish immigrants, impoverished Irish immigrants, gigantic evils. Bostonians, Bostonians of Anglo descent regarded Irish paupers as unwanted burdens on public treasuries. The Massachusetts deportation policy technically applied to all foreigners, but the presence of the Irish, which accounted for nearly, 90% of foreign-born paupers in Massachusetts, their presence was clearly the major driving force for immigration control in Massachusetts. So the nativists called Irish paupers, leeches upon taxpayers, and just like opponents of immigration calls, you use the similar phrases. And the opponents of Irish immigration really advocate the deportation of, quote, an ignorant and vicious Irish Catholic population. Okay. I'll just skip this slide, but yeah, so Irish and the impoverished Irish were called the leeches, upon taxpayers, because as a kind of big financial burdens on society. This image produced a little later in 1880s, and it's a cover image of my book, but it really captures how nativists in 1850s kind of viewed the state of Irish immigration. So the entire poorhouse in Ireland, in this case, the one in County Galway, natives believed the entire poorhouses in Ireland were offloading to their paupers into the United States to become burdens on Americans. So yeah, this one particular is really, I think, illuminating how the Americans kind of perceived Irish immigrants. And honestly, I mean, historically speaking, the accurate truth is that not everyone was pauper, right? Not every Irish immigrant was pauper. Most were self-supportive, if not wealthy, self-supportive immigrants. But again, the perception matters. The perception is that was that every single Irish immigrant was a pauper or potential pauper, just like today, opponents, immigrants. Consider all Mexican immigrants as undocumented immigrants. Similar kinds of stereotyping really applied here. And closely related to this kind of financial and sort of ideological considerations, there was intense cultural prejudice against Irish, which made Anglo-Americans' views of Irish paupers, Irish poverty, particularly harsh. So in the mid-19th century, there was an increasingly accepted view of Irish poverty as a result of Irish immigrants' innate character, kind of part of the ethnicity. In other words, natives thought that Irish ethnicity predisposed, Irish immigrants into poverty, dependency, and pauperism. Clearly, a lot of Bostonians were of Anglo descent, and they inherited, their British ancestors' prejudice against the Celtic Irish people. And those Bostonians in the 19th century really believed that Irish immigrants fostered an exceptionally obnoxious form of pauperism. And I just want to introduce this one letter written by a very famous abolitionist, anti-slavery activist in Boston, whose name is Theodore Parker. He's a leading abolitionist, but at the same time, he was a leading nativist as well. So in a letter to his friend, Parker explained what he called the ethnology of pauperism. According to Parker, Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon, American, English, or Scottish pauperism was easily disposed of. So was Black pauperism. And German pauperism will give us a little trouble, and Jewish was quite inconsiderable. But, he said, Celtic pauperism is our stone of stumbling. The Irishman has three bad things: bad habits, bad religion, and worst of all, a bad nature. So, and he kind of, went on to explain why, again, Irish poverty was kind of part of their ethnicity, and, rather than sort of, consequence of particular financial situations. And he was not the only person who had this kind of view in New
We
York.
just lost you for a second, Hidetaka. Yeah, but you're back, so that's good.
Okay. I
just said everyone's entered just
you.
fine. Good.
I said that, yeah, Parker was not the only person who had this kind of view. In New York, for example, a charity organization really specified Irish as particularly undeserving poor, as the particularly undeserving poor, whereas the charity organization in New York City, consider Germans kind of worthwhile, like worthy of the support and charity. So, in other words, the discourse on poverty was really ethnicized in ways that really criticized the Irish. Now, so the combination of this kind of economic concerns and also ethnic prejudice really led to intense and radical enforcement of deportation laws during the Know Nothing years. So, there was, kind of tangible result of this nativism. So here's the statistics of the number of removed immigrants from Massachusetts. And before Know Nothings kind of came into to power, the deportations were done really modest, at the modest rate, right? Annually, around the 300. But then in the next 3 years, as Know Nothings kind of started the campaign, the number of the people annually removed from Massachusetts jumped to 15,000, and then significantly that range kind of was retained even after Know Nothing years. So you notice, Know Nothing movement was a kind of turning point in the history of Massachusetts deportation policy. One of the characteristics of Massachusetts deportation law was the power of immigration officials over foreigners who were seen as undesirable and removable. So under state law, a foreign pauper, foreign-born pauper could be sent to any place at the official's discretion, such as New York, Canada, Ireland, or somewhere else. Here's the quote, quotation, quoted passage from the actual law. So the law allowed for deportation of any alien on public relief to any place beyond the sea where he belongs. The question is, how can you determine the place where he belongs, right? And the officials have had kind of complete control over this decision. Sometimes, people were deported to New York or neighboring states, and sometimes people were deported to Canada, especially when the person first landed in Canada before coming to the United States. And then sometimes people were sent to Liverpool or directly to Ireland. So the officials had a really kind of complete discretionary power over the deportations. And during the peak of Know Nothing movement, law enforcement became very radicalized, due to the exceptionally intense nativism during this period. And then this nativism was backed up by the legislature, right? So during the Know Nothing years, overseas deportees included US-born US-born children of Irish immigrants and adult immigrants of Irish descent who were kind of partly naturalized. Not partly naturalized citizens are normally treated as citizens. During Know Nothing period, even those who had U.S. citizenship were subject to overseas removal. That was illegal, actually, technically speaking, but again, the officers easily kind of disregarded those kind of formality and then shipped the U.S. citizens to Ireland. And this kind of deportation really created response from the Irish American communities, newspapers in New York and Boston, and I'll just quote some of those, condemnations against the deportation law. So one newspaper said, when, where, and how have the people of Massachusetts obliged themselves to do such deeds as sending natives of her own soil to the honors of all the world poverty? And then another said, how much more will the deportation law be abused under this vile tyranny, which decrees that poverty, Irishism, and Catholicity are crimes and to be punished as such. So clearly the Know Nothing movement create an incredibly hostile atmosphere against the Irish. And then my point is that the hostile sentiment was not simply confined to the level of sentiment. It had a tangible consequence at the level of immigration law and policy. It had a legal consequences, physical consequences for the Irish. Let me make a few questions, the observations before I close and then take questions. I think analyzing the implementation of deportations by know-nothings really is important, for our understanding of American immigration policy. So first of all, anti-Irish natives in the 19th century once again had a really important impact on immigration control to the extent that most historians have overlooked. So the Know Nothing movement, some historians have studied Know Nothing movement, and a lot of historians have heard of Know Nothing Party in the 19th century. But the fact was that the Know Nothing Party was really short-lived. It only was around for like 3 years or something. So it's a short, had a short life, and because of that, historians tend to think that Know Nothing movement was actually inconsequent, insignificant. It didn't leave any important, long-standing legacies, or it didn't make any important achievements. That's the kind of how historians have understood the Know Nothing movement. And as part of that, again, the interpretation has been that the Know Nothing movement never affected America's border policy. But again, as I demonstrated in my talk today, the state level policy, against Irish under the Know Nothings really betrays, kind of challenges those traditional interpretations. Rather than borders being opened, the Know Nothing aggressively sought to conduct the border patrol, and both through entry regulation and also post-entry deportation. So I'm not saying America's borders were never completely closed. After all, the vast majority of Irish did enter the country and they stay and settled, right? But at the same time, there was serious attempt made by the Know Nothings to close the border and then at least patrol the border and then reduce the Irish element. So I would say, yeah, for this reason, borders were never really open, and then Know Nothings really made important deference in the history of immigration law and policy. And I'm saying I want to also add that the Know Nothings kind of made it kind of lingering, enduring legacy. They had an enduring legacy. So as I said, they were just around for like 3 years. But as I said, the level of removal, the scale, intensity of removal can remain the same even after they are gone. So they really set the momentum of border control in the coming years. And in fact, the number really kept expanding. During the Civil War and Reconstruction, the deportations were constantly conducted at high scale. Again, there was no time like 1854 before that. After the Know Nothing movement, and eventually the state laws in New York and Massachusetts became the legal and administrative kind of frameworks of federal immigration law that was introduced in 1852. So here, once again, this is what I showed earlier at the beginning of my talk, this is how historians have understood the history of American immigration control. There was an era of open borders, famine immigration never affected borders, and then in 1882, suddenly the United States became a country of border control. Now, with my book, this is how we can understand the history. This is a revised timeline. So once again, there was no era of open borders. I think it's appropriate to call it an era of state control as compared to the era of federal control. And Irish famine emigration did impact state policy, and then the Know Nothing movement did impact made an impact on immigration policy. And eventually in 1882, there were a series of new federal immigration laws, but these laws were, as I said, modeled on existing state laws in New York and in Massachusetts. My last point is that the manner of law enforcement by the Massachusetts Know-Nothings laid important foundations for the harsh aspects of later federal immigration policy. One of the most important characteristics of federal immigration control from the late 19th century onward, even today, is the almost unlimited power of inspecting officials, like border officials, over foreigners, which scholars often refer to as a plenary power doctrine in American immigration. So the plenary power doctrine assumes that Congress and also executive branch, the president, possess the absolute power over the admission and removal of aliens. As a matter of national sovereignty. Immigration policy is it's a matter of national sovereignty, and as such, immigration policy is beyond judicial oversight for constitutionality. This is how courts interpreted immigration policy and the power of immigration officials from the late 19th century onward. And this doctrine is still, it remained kind of the guiding principle of American immigration policy throughout the 20th century. And even today, it's still in play today. And historians really identified anti-Asian sentiment in the late 19th century as the roots of this doctrine. So there were a series of court cases over Asian immigrants admission at the level of Supreme Court. And oftentimes, historians refer to those court cases over Asians as the kind of starting point of the plenary power doctrine. I think legally speaking, I think that's right. But at the same time, I think when it comes to the manner of removal, that is to say, the power of immigration officials over foreigners. And I think, when it comes to that point, I think the way Irish were removed by the Know-Nothings really set the kind of precedent for the way immigrants would be treated. And Know-Nothings power really became a kind of precedent for later immigration officials' power over foreigners. So for those reasons, once again, anti-Irish sentiment and also the deportation of Irish immigrants, including the manners of removal, had an enormous significance for our understanding of the history of American immigration law and policy. So I stop here, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you. That's fantastic, Dr. Hirota. I just wanted to ask you quickly, I see we have a few questions already, which is great. Can you speak a little bit about, you mentioned that the US born children, even of some of these, and some naturalized citizens. So, war, and I see on your table that the Charities Bureau that put together, actually deported more people sort of than the Massachusetts, whatever the other one was. Were these people, do you think, genuinely poor? Or like, I was looking at the dates for the Charities departures, it's after the Civil War, so these could be veterans, that were maybe injured, or widows that were left because their husbands died fighting. Have you any sense of the people, that were expelled?
That's a great question. And there's a limit in our knowledge about the kinds of people who were removed, because we don't really have the detailed records of the profiles, right?
Yeah.
What we know is that the criteria the standard was really simple, whether or not this Irish immigrant was an inmate in workhouses, arms houses. Like, in other words, technically, every single Irish immigrant in public arms houses could be deportable.
Wow.
So it's not like officers suddenly kidnapped Irish immigrants randomly on the streets. That's not how removals worked. Officers visited the public charitable institutions and then checked the inmate's background, nationality mostly, and then if they found out that this inmate has no U.S. citizenship or Irish born or of Irish ethnicity or of Irish descent, then that would make the people removable. So they could claim, especially after the Civil War, they could claim that, I'm a civil veteran, and I did come across the inmates who were actually civil veterans, like of Irish descent. I didn't really come across the actual case of deportation of civil veterans, but to my knowledge, profiles, backgrounds, larger sort of social connections played minimal role in as officers decided who should be removed. It's really about citizenship, ethnicity, and then the simple fact that this person is an inmate of a arms house.
And so, not to put you on the spot, and maybe you can't answer this, and this will kind of feed into David's question. When officers went to those workhouses and went through the records and saw, oh, here's an Irish born or here's a German born, were they more likely to deport Irish born out of all of the other ethnicities, or did you find that tracked?
So that's a great question, and again, I can't numerically, quantitatively verify the composition of deportees. In terms of the ethnic breakdown of deportees, but rarely Massachusetts officials discussed German pauperism, even though there were German and English paupers, and then. Interestingly, the Massachusetts officials made some positive remarks of non-Irish paupers, whereas they tend to say explicitly negative comments on the Irish. So, for example, Irish woman inmate, for this woman, the officer said this normal, stupid Irish girl, whereas the for the, I think, French Canadian, actually, interesting Catholic, French Canadian, the officers made poor but clean and wise, something like this. So altogether, if you see the petitions of Bostonians or the way policymakers, law enforcers discuss the whole policy, it's clear that the whole thing was really driven as an anti-Irish measure. Okay. And then at some point in the 40s, the census population actually Massachusetts census actually a distinct category of the Irish as opposed to the rest of foreigners, in the poverty in the poor population. So that's it's clearly an anti-Irish measure. And then the only thing what I want to add here is that I often receive this question. So did religion play any role in the implementation? My answer is that not as important as general poverty, because officials never checked the deportees, faith. Whether the person is Protestant or Catholic. Maybe there's an assumption that every single Irish was after all Catholic, so they might have thought that they don't need to even check the religion. But yeah, at the side of enforcement, religion seemed to play relatively minimal role. I would say that religion played an important role as anti-Irish sentiment kind of developed, as those policies became institutionalized, of course, religion played an important role in the general anti-Irish sentiment. But when it comes to implementation, once the policy is all set, I think religion, there were some other considerations other than religion.
Okay, well, that kind of answers David's, but let's look at it. He says, do you think that the anti-pauper movement was really a PC, a politically correct way of expressing the anti-Catholic sentiments of the Protestant majority of New York and Massachusetts at the time? Because anti-papist sentiments have this long history going back to colonial times. So, I think you kind of answered that. I would assume at this point, they're assuming that the majority of poor Irish are Catholic, particularly post Great Hunger,
Yeah, so it was easy for natives to justify the policy, right? If they resort to the economic consideration, then I do think still the economic concerns are central if you just focus on how the policy operated. But at the same time, I don't want to underestimate the strength of anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiments. And again, it's a kind of a disguised way. It's a way to, the deportation was, economic deportation is a way to sort of hide underlining intentions against the Catholics and Irish in particular.
Yeah. We have another question. I was wondering what immigration policy at this time was like in neighboring states like Vermont or Pennsylvania. Did policymakers try to enact the same restrictions in those states?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can't really survey the whole thing, but a few things can be said. One is that most northern states and even southern states had poor laws that provided for the banishment of transient beggars. So as Elizabeth kind of mentioned at the beginning, America's passenger law and New York, Massachusetts deportation law, immigration restriction laws, everything was really based on English pro law. And under the English pro law, transient beggars could be forcibly returned to the place where the transient beggars allegedly belong to. So for example, a transient beggar from Boston in Philadelphia could be sent back to Boston under Pennsylvania pro law. So those laws were, those laws kind of existed in most seaboard states. But when it comes to the implementation, most states were not that serious about it. Pennsylvania did implement those pro laws for the purpose of domestically, banishing transient beggars, but not so much. But Pennsylvania didn't really do overseas deportation of immigrants back to Europe. I think New York and Massachusetts in particular, was the kind of exceptionally radical in this regard. And in Vermont, those states definitely did have some colonial laws, pro laws, inherited from the colonial periods. But those laws were more or less dead letters, I would say. And interestingly, southern states also had passenger regulation laws in theory, but the southern states were largely interested in inviting rather than restricting, immigration, especially white immigration, European immigration, because they knew that most whites, went elsewhere, like in New York, Boston, Philadelphia. So in New Orleans, Louisiana, for example, they actually tried to suppress the implementation of immigration laws, or to suppress the news of yellow fever, because that kind of news would discourage immigration, right, to the states. So southern states are more or less kind of encouragement policy rather than exclusive policy, even though technically there were some regulatory laws.
So the implementation is exactly what Siobhan is talking about. What was the removal process, and could immigrants fight it? Very good.
Yeah. So thank you. So technically, here's how things worked. so the officials, yes, state officials visited public almshouses, charitable institutions, not just almshouses, but also what was called lunatic asylum, like a hospital for the mentally ill. And they check the admission registers, and then as they identify foreign-born, like non-Americans, they could technically remove all of these. And it looks like there is some hierarchy, like priority, applied to certain immigrants. So a lot of the Irish paupers, or again, lunatics, those with mental illness, were sent to neighboring states like New York and Maine, because the domestic removal was cheaper than overseas, shipping, right? And when and immigrants couldn't really fight against this decision, but what they could was to come back to Massachusetts. So
like they're literally put on a bus, kind of, and driven across the border.
Exactly. It's like today's policy. They were literally dumped on neighboring states at the borders, like Albany, for example. From Massachusetts. So immigrants could always go back if they want, and then it looks like officials took a harsher approach to those kind of repeaters. So in admission records, there are some statements like this is second time admission, third time admission, Ireland next time, or this girl was already sent back to New York. If she comes again, she should be sent to Ireland or Canada, so that return would be difficult. So this is how the removal process operated. And also one more important thing is that
we'll just give it a second, right? When we're
do I sound well? Hello?
Yeah, oh good, you're back.
Oh, okay. Do I sound well? Okay, yeah.
Saying they would do it to make the return more difficult.
Yeah. And one more thing about the removal process is that technically, the immigrants in question must be tried at courts. So they should be brought to courts, and then the courts would issue a removal warrant.
Okay.
So that's the technicality. But what happened is oftentimes the officials, especially during Know Nothings, officials can bypass the whole thing, and then simply send the immigrants from almshouses to ports and then ship them away to Liverpool. So it's essentially bypassing legal proceedings, and it's illegal actually in this regard. But this kind of illegal removals became widespread, and it became the point of criticism again, actually, from the opponents of this policy, saying that it's a really proceeding without like justice or
due process.
Due process. Yeah, exactly.
And they must be like separating families, maybe then, because maybe somebody is in the mental hospital, but the wife might not be, or the children,
one of the immigrants who were deported was this Irish immigrant whose name is Hugh Carr, who developed the symptoms of insanity, and then he was accommodated at the lunatic asylum in Worcester, Massachusetts. And when the rest of his family, like sisters, visited him at the Worcester, Massachusetts lunatic asylum in Massachusetts, the sisters realized that her brother had been shipped to Liverpool like 2 weeks ago, something like that. So yeah, family separation was part of that, and if the officers wanted to keep the family together, that means essentially citizen deportation. So the kids, US-born children of poor immigrant mothers, Irish immigrant mothers, they were shipped to Ireland with the immigrant mothers. And again, in theory, that's citizen deportation, and that is not permitted And then, as I showed in one of the slides, citizen deportation was, it was heavily criticized by Irish immigrants.
But, here we are, like anyone who's been following the news for the last, 3 to 20 years, it's these terms, family separation and forced deportation, even American citizens, it still is happening, really. So it's amazing how little has changed, and how we deal with the problem. While you were talking, Hidetaka, I was very interested in this idea too of poverty. I remember we had Professor Tyler Anbinder on last year, and he gave a talk about how actually, particularly in New York, and particularly famine era immigrants who had people here already, were much quicker up the ladder than is previously. We have this kind of idea in our head, they last 7 years and they die. So he says, like, this chain migration, actually they were much better off. And I took part in something in Senate in Washington, D.C. years ago with a group of immigrant societies, and they were saying how immigrants today are the most entrepreneurial class that we have in America. So particularly, Asian immigrants and people from India, they come, they open a store. Even if it fails, like within a year, they've opened another business or a restaurant, because they can, all kind of hands on deck, and they open businesses. So, now you're even questioning whether this poverty, and I know that they're getting them out of the workhouse, so there's obviously a certain element, of poverty, but actually those people would not probably have been like indigent or reliant, like, on social welfare as it was forever, had they been given a chance, maybe. Can you talk?
I think Professor Anbinder's work is enormously important, and and I mean, I know his work very well, and I really respect his work. And whenever I give my book talk, I always make sure that we should not really overestimate the scale of deportation, even though there are some extreme cases. But then the important fact that we should keep in mind is that, after all, the vast majority of Irish immigrants, those family immigrants, were allowed to enter the U.S. Whereas later in the century, Chinese were excluded categorically as a racial group. So that's a huge difference that we should not forget. So I never emphasize the scale itself as compared to the number of those who were admitted. And I think the upward mobility that the Irish immigrants, famine Irish, ended up achieving, it's enormously important. And at the same time, I think there was a legal and administrative legacy of the anti-Irish removal, and that's something that is centrally important to me. So it's not kind of, well, my point is that even though the scale might be not that great, Irish pauper removal was not an isolated event in history. As I said, it kind of laid legal and administrative foundations for later federal policy that eventually became kind of gigantic, right? So for that reason, I think, this history is really important.
Well, and I wasn't bringing up the upward mobility to say that it didn't impact the deportations. I guess what I meant was maybe the standard of what the officials were looking for in terms of poverty wasn't as bad as they were claiming, because we know that most of the Irish did survive and thrive. So the figures are, your research shows, like 50,000 roughly to be deported. Boston alone, that's pretty significant. And as you say, the legal foundation is what's striking too. The other thing I came across, it's so interesting, like when you see these individual cases, and I know you can't go into too many individual cases, but years ago I was researching for my own dissertation the Immigrant Aid Society, and they were sometimes asked to help, like some old Irish woman who had worked as a maid maybe for 50 years, and now she's too old and physically incapable of doing the job. So even though she's lived her life in America for 50 or 60 years, probably didn't get married, and this group of do-gooders take it upon themselves to send her back. So I came across one woman's case in particular. She was old and a little bit enfeebled, And, they've just decided to deport her back to Roscommon, which she had left 60 years earlier. And you're kind of thinking, what a fish out of water this woman would be when she was sent home. Like, who did she even know in Roscommon anymore? And so that, can you talk a little bit about the displacement that people must have felt being deported against their will, to a country that they had willingly left,
It's so the most extreme case that I came across is a group of Irish who were Irish men actually who were deported after 40 years in America. So they came way before Irish famine, obviously, right? But again, legally speaking, the length of stay or the level of social attachment, attachment to U.S. society or their previous contributions to the economy, those things didn't really matter at all. The only thing that mattered from the legal perspective is whether or not, once again, non-U.S. Citizen became what was a public charge. So it's a little difficult to analyze the sense of displacement, but I can imagine it's a significant, profound sense of displacement, obviously. And then I want to also add that there's a chapter in my book that kind of traces the aftermath of deportation, what happened to these deportees, and many of them were first sent to Liverpool because Liverpool was a major European port, so it's kind of cheaper to ship them first to Liverpool rather than the Irish ports. And in Liverpool, those deportees from America, from the United States, were doubly further deported to Ireland under the British policy. So the UK had a similar removal policy, especially against the Irish. And Irish removal from Britain became a huge social problem in Ireland. So after the deportation from the United States, those people were further deported to Ireland from Liverpool. And then the final phase of this whole thing is that even in Ireland, local officials consider the returned Irish as outsiders. They from the perspective of Irish officials, they no longer belong to Ireland as a result of their emigration. So the Irish officials so I did a lot of research in Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Galway, the records of local almshouses, and then charity officials almost unanimously complained about American and British deportation policies, saying that, not really out of the humanitarian grounds, saying that those U.S. British officials were imposing the undesirable burdens on us, on our community. We don't want these paupers, so one of my arguments in the book is that there was a kind of transnational system of removal, alienation, and banishment across the Atlantic world, United States, Britain, Ireland, and then social marginalization. So the Irish migrant poor sort of were forced into the status of stateless people. They were marginalized and expelled, whether they were in the United States, Massachusetts, Britain, and Ireland. So it's really a story of displacement, transnational displacement.
Yeah. Well, it just tells us there's nothing new under the sun. Unfortunately, I think we still have a fairly conflicted, and conflicting attitude to immigrants and stereotypes that we believe about them and how to deal with them. And that's not to say it isn't a very real, kind of problem, but it's very difficult, I think, to have a humane sort of policy as well, particularly when there are stereotypes and stuff at work.
Right. Yeah.
So thank you very much for that, Dr. Hirota. The copies of the book will be in our gift shop actually next week, we hope, and you can get it online obviously as well, although we do say support your local bookshop wherever you're coming from. We are back in person on the 4th of October. We're doing a screening of The Irish Goodbye and The Quiet Girl on Colleen Keown, the two Oscar nominated films. We've gotten a little film festival up and running with Film Ireland, and then we'll have a whole schedule of talks. Most of them will be, of course, available online, but we've one or two events that will not be available online. So on the 21st, if you're in Albany, it's a Saturday night, we've got Maureen Cahasig and Chris Newman in concert. She's an award-winning harpist and her husband's a guitarist. We have on Zoom on the 26th, which is Thursday, Dr. Jarlath Killeen from Trinity College Dublin. He's going to be talking about Bram Stoker's Dublin and how Irish is Dracula. So I'll post all those events to our Facebook page soon. We have a lot of others. But thank you very much, Dr. Hirota. I'm delighted. Thank you all for joining us. As I say, it's been a long time. It feels like since we've done one of these. So I'm delighted to have you all. And keep in touch. And thank you very much. We'll be in touch with you and hope your book goes well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Good night, everyone. Okay.